So we're on John chapter 6 and verses 15 to 24 that Chris has just read for us there. And about Jesus walking on the water. Let's get some context that we want to get some context on this. I'm going to split this up again into three. The reason I'm doing that, I often do it, is A, to help me, to give it some structure, but hopefully to help you guys in being able to anchor your thoughts, what this is about, and even hopefully go away from here, be thinking about this and what it means. So three different things here. The theme, we need to understand this particular section that Chris has read in context. So we need to understand really the whole chapter, because this whole chapter holds together so strongly. And then I want to look at what is the nature of false disciples and what is the nature of true disciples or true discipleship. So firstly, looking at the theme, it's very important, it's always important to get the theme, the overall theme of what is going on, the context. Any particular passage that we read, it's very easy to misread things if we just look at them in isolation. So we always need to be looking at what's going before and what is going afterwards as well. Now, on a previous occasion, somewhere else, I've preached on chapter 6, the whole chapter together. And I did so because the chapter goes together as a whole. So I want to say that clearly from the outset. In the Bible, we've got divisions. We've got chapters, we've got verses, but they've come later. The original writers didn't put them into chapters and verses. They were put there later by the scribes and monks and it was done for ease of reference. And sometimes those chapter divisions and the verses work well. Sometimes they can be quite arbitrary and out. You think, well, why have they put it there? But chapter 6 works pretty well. It works together as a whole. Previously, when I went through the whole chapter, I had to do it briefly because there's so much in there. And really had to kind of do it as a sketch. To do it justice, to preach through the whole chapter, and to get it in its entirety, which would be the ideal situation, because it all fits together. But to do that would take a long time, so we would be here till at least 9 o'clock tonight. So that's not going to happen. It's not practical. We need to understand the point of what John is saying in this whole chapter. There's a lot going on. There's dramatic signs. There's dramatic miracles. There's signs as John, the disciple, describes them. And there's a really famous discourse after what we've just read about Jesus being the bread of life. There's a theme of bread that runs right through this chapter. He talks about himself being the bread of life. And I won't be, but I think Chris will be dealing with that in more detail on another occasion. But I will be dipping into that a little bit. I can't help but do so in order to get some context. So what I'm saying is that we can't understand this section today about Jesus walking on the water without reference to the bigger picture and the context of all that is going on. So the first point number one, looking at really the kind of whole chapter, this chapter in context. As I've said, there's a lot going on, and it's long. There's 71 verses. And it would be easy in the separate weeks that are given as we go through John's Gospel. And of course, we're not doing it week by week. We're doing it occasionally. It would be easy to get distracted and to lose the thread. So I want to be clear right from the outset what the thread or the overall theme is. And it's about who Jesus really is. That's what the chapter is about. It's about his true identity. And following on from that, the nature of true discipleship in following him. That's what the whole chapter is about. There may be other points that can be drawn out. other points that preachers will bring out about different things. But it's important to be able to hang everything on that theme. It's about who Jesus is. The miracles that he's doing, all the signs that John talks about, are pointers to Jesus, to who he is. And in chapter 20, verse 30, he makes it very clear why he wrote his gospel, so that seeing these signs, understanding these miracles, we may put our faith in Jesus Christ ourselves. They point us to him. So this chapter is about who Jesus is. It's important to grasp that. But I'm going to be looking at this small section that takes into account Jesus walking on water. But there is a lot of drama, a lot of dramatic events that have been taking place. And we need to sort of give reference back to that. And we've just had, as he's undertaken his ministry in Galilee in northern Israel, we have just had the feeding of the 5,000 by the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And the account, if you look there, it says, very, very first few words in verse 1, after this. John often uses that phrase, after this. This does not indicate an immediacy of time. In English, that is how we can sometimes understand it. Well, did this, and then after this, did that. But after this could be any period of time in between. It's just what he has chosen to tell us. There is a chronology, but we don't know how long after. So what was it after? Well, it was after chapter 5, of course. And in chapter 5, Jesus was in Jerusalem at a previous feast. So if that previous feast was the Feast of Tabernacles, we're looking now at his ministry in Galilee of a period of 6 months later, because John himself goes on to tell us as at the beginning of the chapter that the Passover, in verse 4, was at hand. So if previously in chapter 5, if it was the Feast of Tabernacles, we've got a period of 6 months. So after this, 6 months has gone by. If the previous feast in chapter 5 was the Passover, because we don't know, John doesn't say, then we've got a period of a year. And John chooses, for his own reasons, not to tell us about that. This is a year of Jesus inputting into his disciples, probably doing some preaching and talking to people as well. So we've either got a period of 6 months or a period of a year. And obviously, as I say, there was some Galilean ministry going on, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us more details about that. John doesn't give us very much information. And previously, when we were looking at the feeding of the 5,000, our John Popel, he pointed out to us, when he was sharing this, that this miracle or sign, as John calls them, is in all 4 Gospels. That's the feeding of the 5,000. It's there in all the Gospels. So the inclusion of the feeding of the 5,000 by all of the Gospel writers has got to be significant. It is the only miracle that is recorded in every single Gospel. So we have to ask the question, why is that? It's obviously of a great deal of importance. So why have all the Gospel writers included it? There is something important going on, and there's something that John wants us to be able to grasp about this. So looking at the miracle, Jesus is able to stretch 5 loaves that a young boy had, more like a sort of flattish sort of pancake, not loaves as we might get in the shops today, and 2 fish. And that was stretched to 5,000 men. 5,000 men. There were other people there. There were women. There was children. So if you take into account everybody, there could be up to 25,000 people easily, maybe even more. That's a big crowd that are following Jesus. How he projected his voice across that many people, I have no idea. But people throughout history have also had to do that. George Whitefield, for example, and John Wesley in their preaching. So we're talking a lot of people. And somehow they stretched 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed that many people. And we know that that much food will not stretch that far. Jesus somehow was able to increase matter. With human ingenuity, we can transform waste into other products. That's why we go and take our things for recycling. During the war years, any spare metal was collected and melted down to help make tanks and aeroplanes. Metal fences along houses and buildings. We've got one along here at Bethany. They were often cut down. And you can see that the result of that everywhere in towns and in suburbs, where you'll see stubs of metal sticking out of a low wall because they were cut down during the war and used to make other things. But you can't turn a car into 100 cars. And you can't turn a plane into 100 or more planes of the same size. It is not possible. You can turn it into another plane, but you can't turn it into 100 planes. Never mind 25,000 of them. You can't, or we can't, despite our ingenuity and being able to turn this into this, into this, into this, we cannot increase matter. But Jesus, in feeding the 5,000, did. He created out of nothing. And only God can do that. And that's the point that John is trying to make and the other gospel writers. This is not just any ordinary man. This is not just a special man. This is God. Because he's doing only what God can do. He's saying something about the identity of Jesus. It's God. And what is the reaction of the people in the feeding of the 5,000? Well, if you look at verse 14, it appears very positive. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." So it appears, when we read that their reaction is very positive. They recognize that Jesus is sent from God. He's come from heaven. A prophet come into the world. But it goes on to say there in John that Jesus knew their hearts. And they wanted him to be king. And at the end of John chapter 2, previously after the turning of the water into wine at Cana, and the cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem at Passover, we're told that Jesus knew what was in men's hearts, and they just liked the miracles of what was going on, and Jesus didn't entrust himself to them. I think there's something similar going on here. The people recognized something special about Jesus, but they then wanted to make him their earthly king. In their minds, what a great king he would be. He would free them from oppression of Rome, who exercised authority over them at that time, and the overbearing authority of the scribes and the Pharisees who were based in Jerusalem. He would provide, as he had been doing, free food, good food. When people were struggling to make ends meet, struggling to find their way in life, struggling to feed their families. We're not immune to that problem today, but it was a constant struggle. Jesus was providing free food. Wouldn't it be great if he was in charge? And he would heal all their sicknesses and all their illnesses. They didn't have physicians. They didn't have doctors the way that we do. They didn't have medicine and understanding of things the way that we do today. They didn't have surgery and operations the way that we have them today. If you were ill, you couldn't work. If you couldn't work, you couldn't earn money. And if you couldn't earn money, you couldn't feed yourself or your family. Jesus was healing people, left, right and centre, all over the place, everywhere he went. That's why people were flocking to him. He was healing them. Who wouldn't? So the reaction is, well, we want this guy to be king. This is great. This is wonderful. Jesus knew what was going on in their hearts. They did not understand who he was. They just thought, this is wonderful, and we would like this on a bit more of a permanent basis. In other words, Jesus would give them what they wanted. We're told the disciples, in that they were following Jesus, But were they true or were they false? Because they didn't completely understand who Jesus was. Jesus had provided food for them, and they wanted what benefited them in the here and now. So Jesus withdrew. After this story of the feeding of the 5,000, we then got the walking on water, which Chris has read to us. And that is profound in itself. The crowds catch up with him again, and he gives them a long discourse about himself after that event, about being the bread of life, this theme of bread. And he says, let's have a look, verse 32 and verse 33, if you cast your eyes down to chapter 6. He says, Jesus then said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." So we've had the feeding of the 5,000 and the misunderstanding by the people of who he was. We've got the miracle that Chris has read, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm just getting some context here. But after the walking on the water, Jesus then goes out of his way to explain to them who he is as the bread that is given from heaven. Symbolism of the Passover which was at hand. Symbolism of everything that they've just benefited from in being fed. And he goes on to say in verse 35 and verse 41 very clearly, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." He is the true bread from heaven that is given by God. He is saying something about his identity. And verse 41, "So the Jews grumbled because he said, 'I am the bread that came down from heaven.'" They didn't like that. They didn't like that assertion. They reacted against it. Can you see what's going on in this chapter? It's all about who Jesus really is. There was lots of people following him. But many of them didn't really understand it. He goes on to be really bold in his teaching in this chapter about who he is. And in verse 66, I'll have to turn the page, have a look at verse 66. It says, "After this, many of his disciples," John chooses to use the word disciples, "many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him," because they couldn't handle what Jesus was saying. They liked the miracles. They liked the free food. They liked the healing from illnesses. They liked all of the blessings in the here and now that Jesus was bringing. But when it came to his teaching, they struggled with it and they walked away. Because for them it wasn't about who Jesus really was. It was about how they benefited. And Jesus in verse 67 even turns to his close disciples, the 12, and he asks them. And Simon Peter is somehow able to grasp the truth. And he makes it clear, well, they've got nowhere else to go. Where else can we go? And he knows that there is life in Jesus' words. And he knows and recognizes and exclaims who Jesus really is, in contrast to the crowds. They needed him, as opposed to just using him. In your own time, have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 4. And there's a story there of the Israelites when they were going to battle with the Philistines and they were losing. And they said, well, we need to go and get the ark, because if we get the ark, then we'll have that with us and God will be with us and we'll win. And they go and they get the ark, and it's their understanding is not, well, we need God. It's we need the ark. We need the symbol. We need this thing. We need this box. It's God in a box. Let's have that and we'll win against the Philistines. And they don't win. They lose. And they lose 30,000 men. There's a lesson for them. It's not about having God in a box. It's about having God for all that he is, not for what he benefits us in. So the theme, again, reiterating, is true identity of Jesus and the characteristics of true and false discipleship. And it's naive to think that anyone who speaks of Jesus or associates with him is a true follower. John's making that clear to us. He says that some of the disciples turned away. I mean, in that sense, the word disciple that he uses is just a follower. And many who were following him, when it came to it, just walked away. So it's naive to think that anybody who associates with Jesus is a true follower. Many were following, and yet they turned away. Many in the ancient world had their followers, and they went around on their travels and they preached, and they had people who came after them and followed them and were their disciples. In the modern world, too, via social media, some of you may have many followers, but how committed to you are they really? So, let's have a look. Let's turn our attention to the nature of true and false discipleship. Let's have a look specifically at false disciples, the nature of those, and our second point. And I want to split this into 4. First of all, false disciples are attracted by the crowds. Jesus attracted crowds. More people than other teachers and religious leaders had ever attracted. He talked with authority, but he provided for people's needs and healed them of their sicknesses. They flocked to him in massive numbers. We don't currently have those massive crowds here at Bethany. Some of you may be happy and relieved that we don't have massive numbers. That depends on your own personality, depends on whether you're introvert or extrovert, stage of life, needs, whatever. Having more people brings more issues. It just does. But God willing, as we reach out, put things on, let people know about what we're doing here, preach, teach the gospel, we'll have people that come and become part of the community here, knitted into a growing family that cares and laughs and cries and supports each other. That's what we want to see happening. More will hopefully understand Jesus' call on their lives and come to know him and the joy of following him. But possibly, as that happens, some will come for the social buzz. The excitement of people together, because when there is more people together, there can be an excitement. We've just been to a conference last 2 days, myself and Matt and Chris, and then Nicola was there yesterday as well. And there is a certain buzz about being in a bigger crowd and more people and being part of something that's bigger and everybody worshipping God together. There is a certain buzz that goes with that. Fulfilling our need for friendship. Crowds attract crowds. And I'm sure we've all experienced that too. There's something exciting going on, and that attracts more people. There's a world of difference between watching a football game at Barrow or Barcelona, or watching a game at Lancaster, which I've done when I was at university, at the Giant Axe Stadium, or Liverpool. Worlds apart. The overwhelming size of the stadium and the noise, everything that's going on, everybody's singing and shouting for a single cause. You imagine, just think of a crowd in town looking up. Everybody, when you go past, you think, well, what's going on? What is it? And then you stop. And then other people stop. And, well, what's going on? And the crowd attracts a crowd. It's what happens. It's the nature of things. And the numbers grow. And we can see it in Jesus' ministry. He's doing great things. The numbers are swelling. Everybody's there. They're loving what's going on. More and more come as they talk and share with each other. There's drama, there's miracles. It's completely understandable. And Jesus didn't dismiss the crowds. He didn't avoid them. He spoke to them. He taught them. He ministered to them. But I want to say this, and it's important, he didn't prioritize them. We know that from John, 6 months or a year has been going on, and he's been ministering to his disciples, and that's constant throughout the gospel. He spends more time with his people that are closer to him. He doesn't prioritize the crowds, but he doesn't dismiss them. He's not fearful of them. He's not put off by them. He's not perturbed by them. But crowds attract crowds, and some people are in it just for the crowds. Second point, people can be fascinated by the supernatural. When people are fed on a spiritual diet that consists of the message, God will change your life with healing, with miracles, with new and better career opportunities, with an economic well-being, with some revolutionary social miracle, that is going to be enticing and that is going to be popular. People want their lives to improve. We all do. I do. I aspire to a better life. Who wouldn't? It'd be slightly odd not to. We want to be happy. We want to live a life of happiness and personal fulfillment. But messages in some churches can abound with promises of fulfillment via the miraculous, if only the people stick around and have faith for it. Here, Jesus was healing every single day. It was new. People had never known it. Their parents had never known it. Their grandparents had never known it. Their children had never known it. It was new. It was exciting. And for many caught up in the mundane, it was change. It was different. It was fascinating, profound, transformative. Limbs were restored. Eyes were opened. But as in John 2:23 at Cana, when Jesus saw that some of those people were just after the miracles alone, they didn't really understand who Jesus was, he didn't entrust himself to them. Because he knew that they were just after the miracles. They were just after the supernatural. There's another group, false disciples, and it is those who think only of earthly benefits. And as we said, verses 14 and 15 in chapter 6. They wanted to make Jesus king. It reveals the motivations of the Galileans in the ministry and the miracles of Jesus. They acknowledged he'd come from heaven, but they wanted him to be their earthly king to continue to reap the benefits of what he was doing. There was no indication of repentance, no acknowledgement of his authority, no acknowledgement of his lordship. It was more like wow, this guy's amazing. And if we put him in charge, we'll have this all the time. A good man in charge. Freedom from oppression. Who wouldn't want a good man in charge, of course? Freedom from oppression. With Jesus at the helm as a political Christ, he'd be the purveyor of cheap food and a new economic utopia. With this Jesus, they had in mind the task of being able to have their physical needs satisfied and work being less laborious. He multiplied food. But he got it wrong. They had the wrong motives and the wrong intentions. Their belief in him, in reality, was unbelief. For it was based on a complete misunderstanding of his miracle to the 5,000, of what he had done and who he was. For them, it wasn't a sign of divinity, but it was magic power to provide their wants and needs. And we see that in some teachings in the health and wealth gospel as well. It's all about what people can get. We all want health, wealth, love, happiness, success. But Jesus doesn't promise all of that in this life. And I think everybody in this room will be able to testify of some difficult situation that you've either been through or are going through. Some things are really hard sometimes. God is with us. Jesus is with us. We're there for each other and we pray for each other. And there are occasions where we see breakthroughs. But there are other things which can just be ongoing, really difficult. We're not told to focus on our benefits. We focus on who Jesus is as the fulfillment of God on earth. And then fourthly, and we'll finish on this, no desire for worship. So looking at our miracle itself, that of walking on water that Chris read, we don't have a great deal of information from John as to everything that was going on there. We know it's evening. The light's gone. The disciples make their way by boat to Capernaum along the coast. John doesn't tell us exactly where they are at this time. Matthew and Mark don't. Luke mentions that they're in Bethsaida. It's about 5 kilometres. So it's been a very long day. They've been feeding some 25,000 people, dishing out food, collecting all up the leftovers. That's a long day, feeding 25,000 people. The light's now gone. They now need to row 5 kilometres back to Capernaum. So they set off. The weather's against them. The wind is whipping up the waves. They're a long way from shore as they get blown out to sea. And it was the 4th watch of the night, we're told by Matthew. If you have a look at the account in Matthew and in Mark, which is between about 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. They have been rowing for a long time. They're tired. They're fearful. It's the middle of the night, and then Jesus appears to them walking on the water. He's not in the shallow depths by the shoreline. This is out towards the middle of the lake. This is a large lake, 21 by 13 kilometres approximately, which in mileage, it's 13 by 8 miles. It's a big lake. They were along the shore, they'd been blown out to the middle of it, and then Jesus appears to them. Understandably, we're told that they were frightened. You would be. They're tired. It's the middle of the night. It's dark. There's nobody else around. Jesus appears to them on the water. And so you can imagine the reassurance when Jesus speaks to them of who he is. In Matthew's account, Peter gets out of the boat for reasons I have no idea why. Matthew chooses not to tell us why, but Simon Peter decides to get out of the boat and walk towards Jesus. But when they get in the boat together, the wind calms, and the response of the disciples is what? In contrast to the crowds, their response, if you have a look at Matthew chapter 14, verse 33, if you're able to turn there now, Matthew 14, verse 33. The response of the disciples is to worship and to marvel at the true identity of Jesus. See, with the crowds, with the false disciples, with false followers, there is no worship. It's all about what they want. It's all about what benefits them. But with the true disciples, with the true followers, when they're face to face with who Jesus is, their response is to worship and marvel at his true identity. The nature of true disciples. And on this I am finishing. 12 disciples have just personally seen a whole succession of miracles, feeding the 5,000 or 25,000 people. At least. They're still alive despite the trouble of the storm and exhaustion. They've seen Jesus walking on the water. They've seen Peter walking on the water from Matthew's account. They've seen Peter sinking, and yet Jesus reaches out and pulls him back. Jesus stops the wind. Jesus stops the water and all the waves and the storm. And the boat, we're told, is immediately back at the land to which they were going, having been blown out to sea. This is the Son of God. That's what John is telling us. That was their experience. Nobody else can do these things. Nobody else can calm nature. Nobody else can make things out of nothing. And they realize his identity, and their response is to worship him. They follow him and his teaching. They stay with him. And as we go on to see in this chapter, despite the hardships, despite some of the difficulty of his teaching. So the challenge this morning is to us, to me, to you. What sort of follower are you? What sort of follower am I? Do I follow Jesus just because of what benefits me? Do I follow him because he's Lord? Because he's God? Because the reality is, in following him, it's not always easy. It's a joy, it's a privilege, it's an honour. It answers so many issues and problems of life, but it's not always easy. Actually, sometimes it creates its own problems. How do we handle that? Are you following him because of it's what you used to? It's what you do? Go to church? We do this? It's what I've always done. Would you follow him for who he is? That's the challenge to us this morning. To recognise who he is and to worship him. Follow his teaching. So we're going to sing together. We're going to have a chance to respond to determine exactly where we belong. Are we a true follower? What are the actions of a true disciple? It's to worship, recognizing him for all that he is. So we're going to have a chance to sing together. Number 302, I want to walk with Jesus Christ. We're going to sing verses 1, 3, 4 and 5. We're going to miss out verse 2. And as we sing this together, and this should come up on screen as well, you've got a chance to make your own decision. Where is your allegiance? Is it in following him for all that he is? Thank you.